Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the Women in Art and Music Conference. It's my great pleasure to present Project Vox, an early modern women's collaboration in the arts. We have three members of the group: Yasmin Altoun, Meredith Graham, and Dana Hogan, and they're all going to come up to the podium and share this collaborative project with us. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Eve and Elizabeth and the staff at the Center and Juilliard for hosting this wonderful conference. We are so excited to be here, the three of us, and represent our entire team at Project Vox. So Project Vox is a digital humanities project that curates encyclopedic entries on women philosophers. Since its inception in 2014, Project Vox has become a digital space for students and scholars to publish transcriptions of primary source documents, share teaching materials for undergraduate courses, and curate galleries of works of visual and material culture related to philosopher entries. Project Vox has three main goals. First, to provide students at all levels with the materials they need to begin exploring the rich philosophical ideas through our philosopher entries. Second, to provide teachers with the materials they need to incorporate these figures into their courses. And third, to transform our current conception of the canon. To execute all of this work, Project Vox employs a large team of faculty, librarians, staff, graduate students, and undergraduates. As you can see from this map, we have students contributing to all aspects of our project, as our team prides itself on mentorship to and between students. On this map, I have also listed the collaborators and advisory board members, as they are called on to help us complete specific philosopher entries. Through our participation with the Extending New Narratives Project, a global network of scholars who are currently supported by an SSHRC partnership grant directed by Lisa Shapiro at McGill, we are able to identify and work with scholars around the world who share our research interests. One of our goals in working with these scholars has been to encourage the field of early modern philosophy to re-examine women thinkers from this period who have been described as poets, artists, or musicians for centuries, but also who have made rich contributions to philosophical topics. Indeed, many entries published on Project Vox showcase women philosophers in the early modern period who also pursued diverse skills and collaborations in the arts. We assert that their associations with other women as patrons, teachers, and interlocutors can offer valuable models for current feminist projects. Like the early modern women we study, we see our work on Project Vox as extremely interdisciplinary and one that uses philosophy as a grounding discipline, but relies on the work of art historians, musicologists, and historians. Yasmin, Dana, and I were all members of the Project Vox team between the years 2017 and 2023. Yasmin and Dana are both PhD candidates in art history, joining the team in spring 2020. Yasmin served as the team's project lead researcher for images, and Dana served as a researcher and lead researcher for our Tulia de Aragona publication in spring 2022. In the fall of 2022, they co-taught a tutorial course at Duke that introduced undergraduate students to see how Project Vox collaboratively researches and writes entries for its website. I came to the project as a musicologist trying to learn more about project management and collaborative scholarship, and served as project manager and outreach and assessment coordinator from 2017 to 2023, and as a graduate student and postdoc. The aim of our presentation today will be to highlight the kinds of collaborative and pedagogical work that has evolved through almost a decade of digital publications by the Project Vox team. Our paper will survey 3 entries published on the site in recent years that reflect some of the project's research methodologies. These methodologies are innovative in their mobilization of digital platforms and tools but also resonate with the interdisciplinarity and collaborative modes of knowledge production that would have been deeply familiar to the early modern women we will introduce today. Namely, we will focus on the philosopher-artist Ana Maria von Schuurman, the philosopher and music theorist Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, and the philosopher-poet Tullia de Argona. First, we will relate von Schuurman's relationship with her teacher in printmaking, Magdalena van der Passa, to Project Vox's methods of vertical collaboration, undergraduate mentorship, and group authorship. Then, inspired by Sor Juana's meditation of Western and indigenous Mexican philosophies, we will discuss how Project Vox writes its entries with external collaborators. Finally, we will consider how de Argona's publishing strategies can provide lessons for cultivating the modern audiences of Project Vox. While I served as project manager in 2020, we published our first entry on a philosopher who wrote and read languages beyond the expertise of our project team. The focus of this entry was Ana Maria von Schuurman, known for her ability to read and write in over 12 languages. We had traditionally chosen philosophers who wrote and read in English, German, French, and Latin. But with von Schuurman, we now had to contend with Hebrew and Greek from her own writing and Dutch scholarship and translations from the von Schuurman scholar Pieter van Beek. With the diversity of language as a challenge for the first time on our project, we also began to consider von Schuurman's diversity of thought and her creative pursuits more seriously than in our previous entries. She was also a poet, a philosopher, and an embroiderer, and a painter. In light of her various creative and scholarly engagements, the Project Vox team took more care in describing her art and considering it as an extension of her philosophical work. Unlike much of the philosophical scholarship produced by the Academy, Project Vox believes in the expansion of philosophical discourse to include ideas developed through art, music, and other forms of creativity. Scholars have traditionally only accounted for von Schuurman's writing as evidence of her philosophical ideas, but Project Vox chose to include her artwork as part of her canon of intellectual contribution. In this first section about von Schuurman, I will first discuss her prominence as an intellectual and religious leader and artist. Then I will explain how the Project Vox team uses von Schuurman's 17th century practice of learning through apprenticeship and mentorship as a model for the organization and training of our team. In her autobiography, Evryklea, von Schuurman divided her life in two parts, specifically the earlier and middle part of her life that was concerned with intellectual and scholarly pursuits, and the later part when she focused on religious leadership and community building associated with the French Protestant theologian and orator Jean de Labadie. During her early years, von Schuurman argued for the equal education of women, especially in spaces of higher education. As the first woman in the Netherlands to attend any college or university, she argued for her own place in these institutions of learning. Following the scholastic method used in the universities across Europe, she mentioned in her famous Dissertatio, originally published in 1638 and revised in 1641, that all women should be allowed to learn outside of the home and that it would not interfere with their social or familial responsibilities. She was able to introduce her own arguments in a style recognized by the Academy and the philosophers of her day. It was during this early or scholarly part of her life that she mentored other young women. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia was her most famous student and was later able to provide von Schuurman's safe haven during religious exile. Von Schuurman likely met Princess Elizabeth in 1633 during a visit to Leiden to hear the former speak at the university there. Their correspondence began in 1639, where Princess Elizabeth asked questions about organizing her own education and the subjects to study. The Project Vox team argues that although Princess Elizabeth was unable to obtain formal education, she decided to construct her own training through mentorship and study, a process that von Schuurman had developed for herself. Like Princess Elizabeth, the Project Vox team is made up of undergraduate and graduate students who learn philosophy through informal processes. None of us presenting here today studied philosophy before joining the team, but we found that through targeted workshops led by our scholar and co-lead Andrew Janiak, research advice from our philosophy librarian Cheryl Thomas, and our own research skills, we were able to learn the ways to write about these women thinkers, as they were also more than just philosophers themselves. In her later religious years, von Scherman then relied on those she had previously mentored. Deciding to sell her home and leave her comfortable life, von Scherman lived her last decade in pursuit of a religious life according to Labadie's theology. During this period of religious exile, she sought refuge in 1670 with her entire religious community at the Abbey at Hereford, where Princess Elizabeth officially began serving as abbess in 1667. Although in exile, von Scherman was then sought after for her advice on religious leadership from theologians like Quaker William Penn, and she eventually became the leader of her religious community when Labadie died in 1674. Although her ideas evolved from her younger days, von Scherman remained a thinker and intellectual who inspired those who read and considered her ideas. In her artistic pursuits, von Scherman also followed a traditional model of learning and mentoring. Although she overemphasized her self-taught artistic skills, through modern scholarship, von Scherman was connected to Utrecht-based engravers, the Van de Passe family. She likely apprenticed in the early 1630s with Magdalena van der Passe, whose father, Crispin van der Passe, did an early portrait engraving of von Scherman. Scholars also suggest that von Scherman may have received drawing lessons at Gerrit von Horst's studio, another space where she could have met Princess Elizabeth. The Van der Passe family, originally from Cologne, was known for engraving portraits and book covers and began selling to an English market. The family had left Germany for Utrecht because of their Anabaptist faith. Their engravings all have a similar style and were part of a larger unified collection rather than one made up of individual interpretations. It was with Magdalena, the youngest daughter and second generation artist, who was associated with von Scherman. This leads us to a 1633 engraved portrait of von Scherman with her own calligraphy at the bottom. The Latin at the bottom of the image reads, "No pride or beauty prompted me to engrave my features in the unforgiving copper, but it was because my unpracticed graver was not yet capable of producing good work, and I would not have risked a weightier task the first time." Once completed, von Scherman sent the engraving to Konstantin Huygens and Caspar Balios, who responded in their own poetic responses that they interpreted her hidden hands to express her virginity, even though the real reason for concealing her hands may have been her artistic inexperience. This engraving follows the intricately textured style of the earlier printed royal portraits produced by the Van der Passe family. Thus, it suggests how artistic practices of printmaking were transmitted from one generation to another or from one teacher to student. Like this artistic family, the Project Vox team adopts a collective form of authorship. All of the writing on the Project Vox website is attributed to the Project Vox team rather than an individual. We rely on the expertise of the research team, our faculty advisor, and the advisory board members to write each entry, so individual writing styles are incorporated into a collective voice. To ensure that all contributions are credited for their work, we include all of the names on a credits page on our website alongside a correct citation for each entry. In summary, we seek to emulate von Scherman's intellectual and artistic apprenticeship and mentorship, beginning with her father, who taught her Latin, to Princess Elizabeth, Magdalena van der Passe, to Spartus Voitis, and Jean de Labadie. Like von Scherman, we know on the Project Vox team that mentorship is key to developing new skills in writing, research, editing, and publication. It has been through individual and small group mentorship that we have trained undergraduates to be self-reliant of our team, who not only contribute to every publication, but also bring their own expertise, whether as historians, musicologists, or translators.
In April 2021, Project Vox published an entry on the polymath Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Sor Juana was a Creole nun in 17th century New Spain who was prolifically active as a philosopher, poet, playwright, composer, and likely a miniature painter. Her personal library was one of the largest in the Americas at the time. It was also a recurrent setting for her scholarly portraits, like this one here. Since the 20th century, Sor Juana has become a venerable icon in Mexican culture. Several films, novels, and Netflix series have interpreted her life and work for the mainstream. Her face has even appeared on the Mexican pesos. In 1982, the Mexican author Octavio Paz published a foundational biography on Sor Juana. Building on Paz, many scholars in the last half century have analyzed the global contexts and impacts for literary production. By comparison, the philosophical content of her writings has received less attention. Project Vox sought to introduce our audiences to some of Sor Juana's innovative ideas on women's education and on the merging of Catholic and Nahuatl religions. Sor Juana marked Project Vox's first entry on a non-Western philosopher. As such, she represents an important extension of our mission to spread knowledge about figures who have traditionally been marginalized in the canon of philosophy because of their gender or race, among other identities. On this occasion, we were privileged to welcome external student and faculty collaborators. First, two Sor Juana scholars helped us to write the entry and to compile the images that accompany it. Their names are Sofia Ortiz Hinojosa, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Vassar College, and Sergio Gallegos Odrica, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. Sofia and Sergio contributed their language and subject matter expertise that filled certain knowledge gaps of the Project Vox team. They thus helped us to ensure that our entry best represents the colonial and religious milieu in which Sor Juana produced her philosophical writings. Second, this entry benefited from the research of an undergraduate art history student at Duke named Lily Cole. Lily wrote an excellent term paper about one frontispiece portrait of Sor Juana that I incorporated into the entry. Today, I will revisit this frontispiece in order to introduce some of Vox's methods of interdisciplinary and collaborative research on early modern visual culture. Sor Juana's life and work were structured by tensions. Around 1651, she was born the illegitimate daughter of a Spanish captain and a Creole woman. As a child, she avidly consumed books from her maternal grandfather's library. This began her lifelong pursuit of universal knowledge in the liberal arts and sciences. In the 1660s, she became a lady-in-waiting at the Viceroyalty Court in Mexico City and also a Hieronymite nun. In these circles, she earned a reputation as a leading scholar in the Americas at a time when women's formal education was limited at best. Yet shortly before her death in 1695, she was forced to renounce her intellectual and creative passions. In 1694, using her own blood as ink, she wrote a statement of penance and signed it, quote, "I, the worst of all women," end quote. Sor Juana's writings were first published in 3 consecutive volumes in Spain in 1689, 1692, and 1700. These anthologies record her capacious thinking about theology, philosophy, science, and art. The final 2 publications also contain elaborate frontispieces that visually express her uniquely hybridized identity and intellect. Project Vox included both of these images in its 2021 entry on Sor Juana. The following summer, we updated the entry by adding an art historical analysis of the 1700 frontispiece on the right. This image was designed by Joseph Caldevila and published in Madrid as the opening illustration to Sor Juana's Fama y Obras Póstumas. As a commemorative volume, this book is one of the earliest interpretations of her legacy as a Creole nun and scholar. It contains a collection of poems written by contemporaries to honor the late polymath, alongside some of her own previously unpublished works. At the center of the frontispiece, she appears wearing the white tunic and brown hooded scapular typical for Hieronymite nuns. Simultaneously, she is surrounded by a laurel crown that celebrates her engagements with Petrarchan poetry. Various musical and measuring instruments denote her humanist pursuits. The globe, staff of Hermes, and Spanish royal coat of arms allude to travel, intercultural contact, and colonial expansion. Particularly striking are the conventional allegories of Europa and America that flank Sor Juana. To our left, a man stands proudly in metallic military garb, personifying Spanish civilization and conquest. Opposite him stands a stereotypical image of America, who wears a short skirt with bare chest and feet and holds a bow and arrow to signal the perceived technological inferiority of indigenous societies. He poses more meekly with a downward gaze and a hand gesture reminiscent of the Venus Pudica. These figurative representations perpetuate early modern overlapping ideologies of racial and gender hierarchy. Yet other details offset the soldiers' behavioral and sartorial differences. Notably, they stand at the same height and have similar skin tones and facial features. By portraying Sor Juana between these two figures, the frontispiece references her efforts to reconcile Catholic and Aztec belief systems. In particular, the image resonates with the prologue to her play Divine Narcissus, published in 1689. This prologue allegorizes the new and old worlds as characters who narrate the conversion of indigenous peoples in the Spanish colonies. Here, Sor Juana shows sympathy for Native American liturgical practices, including human sacrifice. She has the Spanish and American characters forge a dialogue that results in a comparison of Catholic and Aztec gods. Although she ultimately upholds the evangelical agenda of the Spanish crown, she does humanize and to some extent even identify with the converted characters in her play. I have just summarized the analysis of Caldevila's frontispiece that appears on the Project Vox website. This part of the Sor Juana entry had a particularly collaborative and interdisciplinary genesis. It began as a term paper written by an undergraduate student at Duke in the fall of 2021. That semester, my PhD advisor, Susanna Caviglia, taught an art history course on women in early modern art, where she assigned students to each write about one portrait published on our website. As the lead images researcher for Project Vox at the time, I assisted the students in their research by suggesting readings and images to compare with the portraits they had chosen. After the course, I incorporated some of their papers into the existing entries on the website. One of these students, who I already introduced, Lily Cole, wrote an iconographic analysis of the 1700 frontispiece, arguing that it stages Sor Juana as a cultural mediator between Spain and Mexico. With Lily's permission, I revised her analysis and incorporated it into the section of the Project Vox entry that discusses the textual anthology that the frontispiece originally introduced. My aim was to use this piece of visual culture to enrich our existing description of Sor Juana's philosophical and religious ideas. I expanded Lily's essay with the expertise of Sophia, thanks to the expertise of Sophia, who made the astute connection between the frontispiece and Sor Juana's earlier prologue to the Divine Narcissus. She pointed out that we could even imagine that in a performance of Sor Juana's play, the characters may have been costumed like the stereotypical allegories of Europa and America in the frontispiece. The resulting text reflects a joint effort between different voices from art history and philosophy on the Project Vox team. This interdisciplinary approach is crucial when studying early modern women like Sor Juana, for whom portraits, play performances, and other forms of visual culture were integral parts of their production and early reception as philosophers.
The third individual we will consider today is the Italian philosopher, poet, and respectable courtesan, Tullio d'Aragona. As research lead, I directed the development of our entry on this fascinating figure, a 2.5-year collaboration resulting in a 2022 publication. D'Aragona was born in Rome during the first decade of the 16th century and traveled to major cultural centers throughout the Italian peninsula until her death in 1556. Although D'Aragona made original and sophisticated contributions to the ethics of love, Scholars have more often approached the study of her work through a literary rather than philosophical lens. As the first known woman to participate in the debate on the ethics of love, D'Aragona was compelled to position herself strategically to gain acceptance of her philosophical ideas. 3 aspects of her publishing strategy have also provided lessons to the Project Vox team: how to appeal to varied audiences through interdisciplinarity, how to cultivate a network of diverse collaborators, and how to make our scholarship publicly accessible. D'Aragona's 3 publications include her choral anthology and philosophical dialogue shown here, as well as a reprisal of an epic poem, which was published posthumously. Her interdisciplinary production helped create an opening for her to establish her intellectual authority and disseminate her philosophical ideas. Contemporary prescriptive literature decreed that women should only practice logic amongst themselves and should not argue with men, with the exception of women who were supposed to display their learning at court, such as D'Aragona. Through poems that were later set to music, she advertised her own intellect and participation in a network of literati. She also laid the groundwork for her philosophical dialogue, in which she drew on various philosophical traditions to argue that men and women should be considered as equally capable of the purest, most elevated forms of love. Her first publication was a collection of dialogic call and response choral anthology, the Rime, published in 1547 and dedicated to her patrons Cosimo I and Eleonora de' Medici, the Duke and Duchess of Florence. In addition to seeking legitimacy via these well-respected political figures, D'Aragona also embeds a validation of her status as a pensatrice within her Rime. In her own poems, D'Aragona contends that women are the moral and emotional equals of men. Then, in response, 18 contributing poets and philosophers praise her intellect, talent, and character. This public adulation of D'Aragona's thought in a genre that welcomed women's participation set forth her qualifications as the author of a second publication later that same year in a less conventional genre for a woman author, a philosophical dialogue. An interdisciplinary approach is similarly key to the success of Project Vox's goals. Moving beyond the rigid disciplinary framework of traditional Western philosophy, our site emphasizes the interconnections among philosophy, music, art, history, literature, and other fields in telling the multidimensional stories of women philosophers. By approaching the study of these figures through these multiple lenses, our site aims to appeal to a broad array of students, teachers, and other scholars. In the development and dissemination of her writings, D'Aragona also cultivated an interdisciplinary and geographically diverse network of advisors. She used her choral anthology to publicize her intellectual connections. Archival researchers have also revealed some of her lesser-known interlocutors and demonstrated her connections to musical, political, and military leaders. As a woman, D'Aragona would have been excluded from certain intellectual circles, but she carved inroads to the cultural elite by hosting social and scholarly gatherings in her Venetian and Florentine homes, which were later evoked in her own and others' publications. For instance, writer Girolamo Muzio published songs, sonnets, and a treatise in D'Aragona's honor, publicly championing her intelligence and virtue. He also wrote the preface of her dialogue and facilitated its publication through the printer Giolito. Similarly, the president of the Florentine Academy, Benedetto Varchi, aided her in navigating her relationship with the ducal couple of Florence and published his own testimonials to the value of her virtue and intellect. In their correspondence, Maritere Lopez has found evidence that they offered each other mutual editing services. Among the more general praises of her intelligence by her contemporaries, another friend, Lattanzio Benucci, composed a sonnet specifically regarding her dialogue. Seeking to meet the needs of diverse constituents, Project Vox likewise prioritizes collaboration across disciplines and traditional hierarchies. Our publications are the product of undergraduate and graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and established scholars based in multiple continents. These contributors are not exclusively experts of philosophy, but are specialists in diverse fields, including art history and musicology. Just as D'Aragona's interdisciplinary network enriched her cultural production and helped expand its audience, Our scholarly network likewise enhances our research output and broadens our readership. A third strategy that positioned D'Aragona's work for success was her choice to write a philosophical dialogue in vernacular Italian. The first publisher of D'Aragona's works was Gabriele Giolito de Ferrari, one of the most successful and prolific publishers of vernacular works in Venice. Giolito was also involved in the project of replacing Latin with Italian by both translating Latin texts into Italian and popularizing vernacular works. This campaign supported publishers' interests by increasing the scope of their reading public and therefore their profits. Although D'Aragona was conversant in Latin, the traditional language of philosophical dialogues, she wrote her dialogue on the infinity of love in the vernacular, a choice that both made her ideas available to a broader public and created continuity with earlier expressions of her ideas through her choral poems. Further, she aligned herself with the interests of her Medici patrons, who were deeply invested in advancing Tuscany's cultural hegemony throughout Italy, a project which was intimately tied to the codification of the Italian language as proposed by Pietro Bembo. D'Aragona's work in the vernacular is analogous to Project Vox's commitment to public scholarship. We hold ourselves to high standards in our research, employing traditional academic practices such as external peer review. However, we strive to make our scholarship accessible to the general public as well as specialists by using prose that explains philosophical concepts without jargon or assumptions of readers' prior knowledge. To that end, in recent years, Project Vox has expanded its teaching resources, which include syllabi, philosopher pairings that can be integrated into existing course structures, and an array of searchable materials such as lesson plans, assignments, activities, and discussion questions. Formal philosopher entries are supplemented by an interactive timeline, image galleries, and blog posts offering a behind-the-scenes glimpse into our research process. Polling conducted in the Outreach and Assessment Subteam has confirmed that users value our site as a resource for use in secondary and undergraduate classrooms. Tullio d'Aragona achieved a significant legacy in her own time and in the centuries following through the breadth of her talents, her network, and the accessibility of her works. In that same spirit, Project Vox has developed an audience surpassing 100,000 distinct users in 49 countries by approaching philosophical topics through interdisciplinary lenses, with the contributions of diverse experts, and with sensitivity to how to make this work accessible to our audience. In conclusion, von Sherman, Sor Juana, and D'Aragona each overcame societal obstacles placed on women to gain recognition for their philosophical ideas in their own time and long after. Collaboration and interdisciplinarity were integral to their philosophical pursuits and represent enduring feminist models of knowledge production that Project Vox has implemented in its own spirit of epistemological diversity and inclusivity. As the co-authors of an unconventional form of academic publishing, we have been pleased to find that in recent years, our website has been cited in scholarly articles and books on early modern women philosophers and used in classrooms around the world. But just as importantly, we have been proud to see the works of these philosophers on our site reach beyond particular academic audiences and captivate anyone willing to engage with their ideas. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It was fascinating to hear about this deeply interdisciplinary and collaborative project. I have some basic questions that arose while I was listening. Why did you start from philosophy? How did that happen? And then spread out to other disciplines, that is the organizing principle. And then also, I mean, the other question is, how do you go about selecting which women you write on next, and how does that come about? So I'll just start with those two questions.
So Project Vox started in 2015, as we said, because Andrew Janiak, our philosophy scholar who works on the project, we also, the project is, the other co-lead is a librarian from Duke University Libraries. And the project started because he was working on Newton and then started working Emily du Châtelet. And he had graduate students who were also interested in publishing this work. And it became apparent to the group of them that this could be a wonderful digital project that could then go beyond just an article and live online. So du Châtelet and I'm trying to think of the order when they were published. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll speak to your second question, which was how do we decide on a new philosopher? So that is through many means. Like I said, I was on the outreach and assessment team, which is sort of strange as an academic project to think about that. But a lot of our work is deciding through assessments and surveys with teachers and scholars all over the world exactly what they need in their classrooms. And so that is how we choose our philosophers, is through interviews and through surveys. So it's usually things that are not written about as philosophers, but maybe in art history or musicology, and then kind of changing that. So
this on. Yeah. We also have a pretty extensive feasibility process. We assign people to do preliminary research about philosophers that we're considering, but we're not sure, for example, what kind of images are available to publish alongside the entry, or what kind of scholarship has already been written that we can cite and build upon. So before we undertake any entry, we have students and other members of the team perform usually at least a semester-long feasibility study and create a report at the end of it that we then propose to the team, who takes a vote whether we should move forward with the philosopher.
At any given time, we have an extensive running list of proposed candidates. It's been interesting to watch over the course of our time at Project Vox evolve how the feasibility studies change from year to year, and how our criteria have expanded. We've changed our mission statement over the past few years to first expand the time period and then expand the geography of who we would consider. And so as Meredith began by saying, trying to figure out how the needs of our audience change with who they want to see included.
It's really a very audience-centered project, which is fascinating, as museums are also moving. And then another question, I mean, you have this list of authors, and then you said that there's a peer review process to a certain extent. How do you know when an entry is done, or are you still, do you revise things? So is it sort of ongoing, there's flexibility built into it?
Yes, it is certainly ongoing. I think one aspect that I mentioned in my part of the presentation is we update the entry. For example, I added that art historical analysis that wasn't originally published based on this excellent paper that we got from a student. And so it's growing. And we try to strike a balance too between trying to retain our own vintage as a site and the original layout of the site and the original citations. And we do try to clean them up, of course, when there's mistakes, but we also want to show the trajectory of the project. And yeah, and there's a revision history as well that we...
Typically, though, we tend to have the development of an entry over the course of 1.5 to 2 years. And during that time, because we have such a diverse group of collaborators, we have students roll on and we have students roll off. And one thing that we started doing recently was having a formalized course. So most of our students were participating as volunteers up to this point. But then we had students that were participating for a semester or for a year. So you, as Meredith showed, the long list of people's participation in different capacity, those might not all be taking place at the same time.
And I imagine you take feedback, that there's a place or where you can offer. Do you have sort of, I mean, I'm seeing it sort of as like a letter to the editor, like, no, I object to this. I mean, how has that been? Because you're taking this interdisciplinary approach, and some people may feel very like fixed on a figure identifying in one discipline or another and not, you know, quite as fluid. So I wonder, I don't know if you could speak to that. I know it's sort of. a large question.
This came up when I was project manager, and I won't get into the details, but I think we definitely got a letter to the editor if that is, and someone didn't appreciate our take on a specific philosopher, and we used it as an opportunity to bring that person in and say, okay, how would you change our entry, and what would you add to it? I don't remember exactly what we ended up doing in terms of changing the entry, but it was a nice way to say, yeah, we don't know how to read in that language, or we don't know exactly what is happening at that time, you know, because our expertise is so varied. So please help us, you know.
I love hearing about this flexibility. Okay, do we have questions from the audience? Don't everyone raise your hand at once. Yes. Oh, sorry, Stephen. Yes.
Hi, everyone. That was really a wonderful presentation, and I'm obsessed with your website, and I'm on it on my phone. And I, you know, the one question I have is the obvious AI question, because I'm looking at a blog where you were talking about artificial intelligence and hallucinated histories. And so the real question is, how have you been expanding as you've gone by? You said something about your interdisciplinarity and geography, but with, you know, given that you're digital, right? And with the onslaught of AI or ChatGPT or these other things, has that become more and more a part of the conversation, and has that, and how has that affected, if at all, the way that you do things?
So I should first say that all three of us have graduated for Project Vox, so I can't speak to exactly what they're doing at this very moment. But when we were on the team, and I just finished as a postdoc in the spring, is that we do not use AI or chat to write our entries. But a lot of that question in that blog post came from image research, because we have a lot of questions when we're researching about where does this image come from. Y'all can speak more to that, but that has been a part of our image research, the image research methodology.
So when you go on our site, you'll see that there's a specific tab called Image Gallery. So for every philosopher entry we publish a corresponding corpus of images related to that philosopher. And this is where we begin to get into more art historical kinds of questions. For example, there are a few figures who, for different reasons, we've not been able to find a portrait of them, an extant portrait. So the question then becomes, how do you portray someone without a portrait? And in that case, we begin to draw images of their interlocutors, people who were in their network, contemporary maps, frontispieces, works of material culture, like on Sherman's embroidery. We have some of her embroidered works on the site. So that's one kind of art historical question we've begun to ask. Another is, like, what does a philosopher look like when we don't have a portrait? What should a philosopher look like? And how does that change when she's a woman? For example, with the Tullia d'Aragona entry, as both a courtesan and a philosopher, the way a courtesan looked is not necessarily the way a philosopher would have looked. So when she's both, how does that introduce tensions in the representation? And of course, you get into questions like allegory and representation. When you don't have an image of a figure, how do you represent that figure? So those are all our historical questions that we've begun to integrate. But I think most generally, our goal, I think Dana and I as our historians, our goal has been to make sure that images are more than just accessories on this website, which is often what ends up happening. Like in a philosophy book, the author's portrait might be on the cover, and that's all you learn about that painting or whatever. But we want a more critical engagement with the images, and we want our audiences to develop that kind of visual literacy that you might get in art history classes, but not otherwise.
I'll just add really quickly to that point. When Yasmin and I developed the tutorial course last year, there was a 50-50 split between image research methods and philosophical research methods. So our students got a really good grounding, we hope, in both approaches. Yeah.
Any additional questions? Yes, at top.
Hello. I had a question about Anna Maria von Scherman. And as you are talking about her life and her interests and the reach of her networks, I was imagining, because of her life dates, that she would have known or known about Ioannis Komenius, who's a member of the Bohemian Brethren. And so even if you haven't yet engaged him, I think you would find him really interesting, both because he supported women's education and because he wrote the first picture book, Orbis Pictus. But it leads me to the larger question about how far you go with networks. You are focusing on women as creators and as philosophers, but then how deeply do you go into the networks that they are engaged with?
Can I just ask, what do you mean by how far do we go? Like, can you be a bit more specific?
Well, on one hand, you're celebrating their individual contributions, and on the other hand, you're trying to bring them into a kind of societal or some kind of community. And I just didn't know how far you could go on forever, infinitely, in terms of where you would set the networks.
Thank you very much. And we have several approaches to that. First, on many of our philosopher pages, we have a grid of different types of people they were connected to. I mentioned with Tullia d'Aragona, her connections with different interlocutors or her social connections, political figures. We have toyed in the past few years with different ways of visualizing networks, and we have had sub-teams do summer projects about developing models for network analysis, and that's something we hope to do in the future.
I was just going to say, when we're trying to build these network visualizations that Dana was just talking about, it's very difficult for us to make value judgments on the strength of a relationship based on a letter when one might have been destroyed. So that's a difficulty that we've been having in terms of making those network connections. But in terms of, if you're asking a very basic question on how much do we go into who the philosopher like Tullia is corresponding with, we definitely explain the other side of the ideas so that they appear in conversation, right?
Also, one thing we've added to our teaching resources relating to that is the philosopher pairings. The more profiles we do on individual philosophers, the more we notice overlapping themes, either socially or in their modes of expressing their ideas. And so we've developed these sort of cards where you can search or filter philosophers if you want to teach only philosophers that communicate their ideas through poetry, or if you want to teach philosophers from a certain time period. So we address both the philosophers' connections to each other, as well as their connections with outside figures and with their male contemporaries. Yep.
I'll just add one kind of related thing, but it kind of gets at our site. You'll see it's very figure driven. It's a list of individual figures, and that's how we're choosing to tell this story, this revised history of philosophy. And we have considered more recently, rather than non-canonical figures, non-canonical concepts that we can focus on and make the subject of an entry. We haven't published any yet, but for example, Dana was leading a team who was researching poetry as philosophy and other early modern forms of writing other than philosophical dialogue or treatise, where women could express and introduce philosophical ideas. So not exactly related to your question, but thinking of networks and trying to revise it so that it's no longer an individual figure who is the focus, that's another kind of something else we're thinking
Thanks. I think, did I see a hand here? No. Oh, there's one up there. Okay. Thanks.
I just want to say that this is just so exciting because your method is learning by doing, but you include your students. So your students see how professors actually learn. So they're being instilled with a kind of pedagogical model that will last a lifetime. And that's really so exciting. But I did have a question. I haven't seen your website, but are you considering, or do you have a kind of fortuna critica of these women's publications or contributions to see how their work has been received since its, publication or since its making?
Thank you very much. We do within each profile we have on individuals. And so we have the same rough template for each of our philosopher entries, but within that frame, the amount of text we devote to each aspect varies by the interests of the team or by what we know about that individual. So for example, going back to Tullia d'Aragona, we did a little bit more of a review of her critical fortunes because of this interesting aspect of her identity being what we call a respectable courtesan, how her works were republished centuries after her death, but then they drop off because of different sort of restrictions about propriety. The fact that she was a courtesan then becomes problematic in later centuries. And so she disappears from the historical record for a little bit, and then she pops back up in more recent decades. So depending on what is happening with each individual figure, we do get into that. Thank you.
Are there any further questions? Oh, Melissa, sorry, I can't. See. Thank
you. My question has to do, actually, the answers that you just gave sort of prompted the question. I mean, I worked on a project that was trying to think about women's role as historians of art historically, before art history is an academic discipline. And one of the things that, I think that when the idea of talking about, philosophy that's being written in other kinds of formats than the traditional ones, I mean, it begs the question about what is philosophy? I mean, what do you call philosophy? What do you call history of art when it's, so I guess I'm sort of wondering about that, like what your parameters are for sort of defining somebody as a philosopher. I mean, is having an idea and articulating that idea in writing or in painting or whatever, is that philosophy, or is it, yeah, I guess that's my question, is how are you thinking about what philosophy is or what constitutes philosophy? Just a little question.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that although we do make some original arguments in our site, that we are somewhat cautious about labeling somebody a philosopher to be the first ones to do that. So we tend to choose individuals that have been identified by other scholars as philosophers. And again, that doesn't mean that they are necessarily first and foremost identified as philosophers. With Tullia d'Aragona, it was just a few people. But once we find a few scholars of philosophy who have sort of put their stamp on it, then that opens us up to work with the figure. As Meredith mentioned, none of the three of us are philosophers or scholars of philosophy by trade. So it wouldn't, I think, be for us to say whether someone is or is not. Yeah. Sure. Right. Oh, okay. So just to give an example of our feasibility process. So when I came onto the project first, I really wanted to do an Italian philosopher. We hadn't had one before. And I was hoping to find a figure that could connect to my own personal research in art history. And so I was looking at candidates that would suit me. And I found Tullio d'Aragona. And so I spent a year as a volunteer developing a feasibility proposal for the whole team. And then I really had to pitch her to the team and campaign for her, vote for Tullio. And fortunately, it was successful, but we really have had a number of feasibility proposals that in the end, we decide for one reason or another, it's not the right fit for us right now, or some of our team members believe this is a great example of a philosopher, but we have to hold off for now. So we do have criteria for selection, but it changes. So, but as I was saying before, we won't be the first people to say this is or this is not a philosopher.
Okay, I think with that, please join me in thanking Project Vox for this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. All of the sponsors, all of the assistants that we had both at Juilliard and at the Center and at the National Gallery of Art for this extraordinary 3-day conference, learning about women in art and music. It has been a wonderful collaboration and hopefully a model that will continue in other ways. For both of our institutions. So we just want to extend our warm thanks. I don't know if you want to say thank you too.
Not much more to add to that. I had a lovely time and I hope you did as well.
Yeah, I want to thank you for everyone, for our audiences, both virtually and in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I'll see you at the concert.
Yes, and for those of us who are here in person, there'll be a concert in the West Garden Court at 3:45. So there is a bit of a pause, but I hope you'll join us at the concert at 3:45 in the West Garden Court, which is the West Building of the National Gallery of Art. Thank you so much.